A single missing letter tore my first love out of my life. A stormy night blood drive saved her without me realizing it. And 4 decades later, I ran into her by the dairy cooler at a Kroger with a gallon of milk sweating in my hand. Hey folks, it's Charlie Greer with mind-blowing stories. Pull up a chair, because this one is as true as the creases on my hands. Before we dive in, I need to say something. 96% of the folks who watch my videos are not subscribed. That number sits heavy in my chest. If you enjoy stories like this, please hit that red button, toss a like on this video, and drop a comment to tell me what you think. It keeps the lights on in this old room, and it means the world to me. I'm 67 and retired from the sheet metal trade. I made my living bending steel into shapes that behaved better than I did in my 20s. I've worked in plants where the air hummed and the floor shook and you couldn't hear yourself think. Maybe that's why I talk now. I got words stored up like beans in a pantry, and some stories sit in the dark a long time before they're ready to see daylight. The one I'm about to tell you begins on a wet Ohio evening in the summer of 1979. I was 21 and driving a sun-faded blue Ford pickup with a heater that worked better than the radio. I had a coffee thermos that tasted like coffee forever, and a little toolbox for the kind of problems a man thinks he can fix. I just finished a long shift at the paper mill in Chillicothe. The sky looked like it had been scrubbed with steel wool. I was half dreaming about a hot shower when I saw a car on the shoulder with its blinkers pacing like a nervous heartbeat. She was on the gravel shoulder, shoulders hunched, hair dark with rain. The first thing I noticed about her was that she wasn't trying to flag anyone down. She had the trunk open, and she was doing battle with the spare tire like it was a stubborn jar lid, and she was just going to handle it herself. I admired that. I pulled over and said, "You look like you could use an extra set of hands." She studied me like a deer in the woods, not sure if I belonged, then nodded. "Name's Lena," she said. Her voice was low and steady, Kentucky in it like a warm note. I told her I was Charlie, and set to work with my jack and a tire iron that had learned all the swear words I knew. The rain lightened to a mist. We passed an hour talking while I tightened lug nuts. She told me she was a nursing student, taking summer classes over in Columbus and helping at the little clinic in town. She carried herself like a person you want in the room when things go sideways. She laughed at my dumb jokes, which I considered a sign from above. When I dropped the car back to its wheels and stood, she looked at the tire and then at me, eyes bright. "Thank you, Charlie Greer," she said. And it felt like my whole name had finally found its place in the world. We went to the Waffle House, because at 21 you believe Waffle House can solve any problem. We split a plate of hash browns, and she took her coffee black. She listened more than she talked, and when she did talk, she didn't waste syllables. She loved old rhythm and blues, and the kind of country that grew out of a good heartache. She kept a little notebook in her purse where she wrote things to remember, a blood type from a patient, a recipe her aunt told her over the phone, a single line from a song. I noticed the way she put that notebook back every time, neat and square, like it mattered to her to keep her tools sharp. We saw each other after that. It wasn't a plan so much as a gentle gravity that pulled us together. We went to the county fair on a humid night when the Ferris wheel lights pulsed like fireflies. She held my hand and squeezed when the wheel rose, but not like she was scared, like she was confirming the world was still there. We danced at the VFW hall to a local band that couldn't agree on a tempo, but agreed on having a good time. We sat on the hood of my truck by the Scioto River and let the water do the talking while our shoulders rested together. Her father was a preacher down in Pike County, and he was set on things being tidy and proper. He called me a mill hand like it was a species of raccoon. Lena met him head on, but not with anger. She had a way of looking at you until you heard yourself and either stood taller or sat down. It got prickly sometimes when I came around. I learned to bring her mother peonies from the roadside stand to soften the edges. We made plans in whispers, because the loud plans always seemed to scare off the future. That August, she told me she was transferring to complete her training in Louisville. It was a big move for a girl who'd always been driving distance from home. She said it made her feel both tall and small at the same time. We sat on my porch steps the night she told me, and I remember the porch light buzzing and the smell of wet dirt, and how the wood under me felt old and patient. "We'll write," I said. "We'll call. I'll save up and move after you finish the semester." I was making a little extra doing duct work on weekends, and I told her I'd put something on layaway. She knew I meant it. We kissed, and I felt something steady set up shop in my chest, not a fireworks thing, more like the strike of a match held close to kindling. The day she left, I carried her suitcase to the Greyhound platform. Folks were crying and hugging, and I, who talk plenty now, couldn't think of a single useful word. She took my face in both hands and kissed me, then put her forehead to mine. "You hush now," she said. That was a thing she said when my nerves started making noise. "You hush now. We'll be fine." She handed me an envelope. It had her new address and the phone number of the apartment she'd share with another nurse named Carol. The number was block letters in her careful hand. "Write me as soon as you get home," she said, "and call me at 9 tonight when I get there." I nodded like a bobblehead. I watched the bus pull away, and then it was just my hand with no hand in it. That afternoon, the sky worried itself into a storm. By 8, the rain was horizontal. There was a pile-up on the highway north of town, and the radio kept crackling about it. Then the announcer put out a call that the hospital's blood bank was running low because of it. "If you're able," they said, "please come to the VFW Hall on Paint Street and donate." I sat on my couch and looked at the clock. It said 8:12. The call repeated. I looked at the envelope with Lena's number. The rain hammered the windows like a deadline. I put on my boots and grabbed my jacket. You make choices with your feet before you make them with your head. Mine carried me to the VFW. That hall is the only place I've been in both for fistfights and for prayer. That night it was a line of people with their arms out, sleeves rolled. The room was warm and smelled like bleach and coffee and wet wool. The nurses moved like a practice dance. I filled out a card, and they asked me my name, and I told them, and they wrote it down on a clipboard, and I lay on a cot and watched a bag fill with a part of me that would go into someone else. I said a small, quiet wish for whoever would need it. When I was done, they gave me a cookie, and I stood up too fast and had to sit down again while the room remembered itself. By the time I stepped back out, the rain had worked itself down to a steady drumbeat. It was a few minutes past 9. I drove home, careful, both hands on the wheel. When I walked in the door, I went straight to the phone. Her number was 9 digits of hope, and I dialed them by memory because I'd said them 100 times all day. I got a recorded tone and a mechanical voice saying the number could not be completed as dialed. I looked at the page, at the way the ink had smudged on the last 2 digits where my thumb must have been. I dialed again anyway, because that's what you do when hope is your only tool. Same message. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, and the operator beeping like a metronome measuring my stupidity. I figured she would call me from the apartment when she got settled. I waited. I fell asleep in the chair with the phone on my chest. She didn't call that night or the next. I wrote her a letter and mailed it. I tried the number again and again. The operator never budged. A week later, I took the layaway stub for the ring I'd been planning to surprise her with, and I walked into the jeweler and put down another 20 and felt both proud and worried. I worked my shifts and tried to keep faith. Finally, I drove down to Pike County to ask her folks if they'd heard from her. Her father opened the door and said, "Lena's gone to Louisville like she said." He had the look of a man trying to herd sheep with a frown. I left a tight, friendly note with her mother that said, "Please tell her I've been writing and calling, and that I love her and I'll be there when she calls back." The quiet stretched out until it became a room I lived in. I wrote 2 letters a week, then 1, then a postcard. No answer. I called late at night in case she worked odd shifts. The mechanical voice kept meeting me, cool and flat, telling me I had a wrong number. I retraced the digits, and sometimes I transposed them and got pizza places or a guy named Trent who swore at me and told me never to call again. I pictured her putting her life together in a city that was a long way from my porch, and I told myself she had found a thread she needed to follow. I tucked my hurt into the glove compartment behind the registration and shut it. I told myself I was a fool forever thinking I could keep something so good. I told myself a lot of things, and I believed most of them enough to keep going. Work will carry you when your heart won't. I hung ducked, I lifted boxes, I came home so tired my bones forgot whose they were. Then I met Sharon. She worked at the pharmacy counter at the big store by the highway. She had a laugh that came up from her belly, and she liked baseball, and she thought onion rings were a food group. She asked about the calluses on my hands, and I told her exactly. And she said I was old-fashioned in a way that made it sound like a compliment you had to earn. She came to church with me one Sunday, and she knew all the hymns. We were both a little dented. We took to each other in a way that felt like a good chair in a quiet room. Life is not a movie. Sometimes the love that arrives second is the one that teaches you how to stay. I never told Sharon about Lena at first, because it felt like a dream that would vanish if I tried to explain it. Over time, as you do in a marriage, you open the drawers and show each other what's really inside. One night, I pulled the envelope with the smudged number out of my old army surplus coat and set it on the table. Sharon read it, her eyes gentle. She tapped the spot where the ink had bled. She said, "Looks like rain got to it." Then she took my hand and held it until whatever was hurting sat down and caught its breath. She was like that, steady and warm. We made a home with the good stuff and the hard stuff braided together. We never had kids, which is one of those things people ask you like they're asking about your favorite team. It wasn't that we didn't want them. It just didn't happen. And then it was later. And then bodies and hearts had their reasons, and we believed them. We had friends, and Sunday dinners, and a little camping trailer that smelled like dust and pancakes. We had a life. Every now and then I would catch a song on the radio that had lived in Lena's notebook, and it would thrum something in me. I would put my hand on the dash and say, "You hush now," and the ache would settle. Time moves unevenly. Some weeks slip like soap, and some years stitched themselves to your coat. In 2018, someone I didn't know sent me a Facebook message. The profile picture was a dog and a baby and a sunrise. She said her husband was renovating the old 3-story building I used to rent a room in when I was 20. He'd pulled off the baseboards, and a little avalanche of paper had fallen out, mail that had slipped through the slots behind the radiator decades ago. A bunch of letters and postcards had my name on them. She asked if I wanted them. My heart hammered. I wrote back yes with shaking hands, and then I sat there with the computer glow on my face like a ghost light. They met me in a parking lot in a Subaru full of sawdust and pride. The woman handed me a shoebox, rubber-banded. I sat in my truck and opened it. The first envelope on top had my name on it, in a hand I hadn't seen in 40 years, but knew like my own. Lena's careful block letters, the loops squared. The postmark was from Louisville, late August 1979. Inside, a sheet written neat and firm. She said she'd arrived safe. She said her roommate was nice, and the apartment had a balcony where pigeons held committee in the mornings. She said she'd be at the Greyhound that night at 9 to call me when the bus rolled in case I could pick up. She included the phone number again at the bottom, darker ink, no smudge. I felt the floor go sideways. I read it twice, and the 9 had become a 4 in my mind back then, or my thumb had dragged a wet mark until it looked that way. I'd been dialing the wrong number all along. There were more letters. She had written each week, sometimes twice, in those first months. In one, she told me about a little boy she sat with in the recovery room, who asked her to hold his hand while he fell asleep, because he didn't want the bad dreams to catch up. In another, she sent me a page torn from a magazine of a place in the Smokies that looked like heaven and said someday. The last letter was different. The handwriting wavered. The postmark was 2 weeks after the first. She said there had been a bus accident the night she arrived. She said she had been on it. She said she was in a hospital bed with a busted pelvis and a chest that hurt when she laughed. She said she kept asking for me, but they told her no one had asked for her. She said she was worried about me. She said if I chose to step away, she would understand, because life is not an obligation. Then the writing stopped mid-sentence like a power cut. I sat there with that page in my hands and realized that while I had been lying on a cot at the VFW with a bag of my blood climbing down a tube, she had been on a gurney under bright lights 100 miles away. I put the letters back in the box and looked at the horizon. Everything in me wanted to drive to Louisville right then, but I also knew life had laid tracks since then, and I could not tear them up because I wanted to hear an old song. I went home and told Sharon what the box had shown me. She listened and touched the papers like they were bird bones. She said you should find her, but not because you are missing something. Because there is a truth here, you both have been walking around like a hole in the yard. She handed the words back to me, and I knew why I'd married her. I looked up Lena Carter and found a nurse in Lexington named Helena Malone. The address led to a little white house with a crepe myrtle out front. I held the phone in my hand so many times and never dialed. Sharon's memory was beginning to wander then. She would put her keys in the freezer and accuse the cat of hiding them. She would forget the name of the neighbor she'd known 20 years, and then remember every lyric to a song from 1968 without missing a word. I became the one who made the lists and folded the laundry and learned how to ask the same question gently. There is a particular kind of holy in a marriage when you become each other's memory. When she got sick, I sold the ring I never gave to Lena to pay for a medication that insurance balked at. I stood in line at the pawn shop and thought of all the futures a piece of gold has carried in its pocket. I drove home and held Sharon's hand while the medicine did its quiet work. She passed on a cold morning when the world was washed clean and the river looked like glass. The house held a shape after that, like a guest had just left the room. I got good at talking to the empty chair in the corner, because it turns out you keep talking anyway. For a long time, I did not open the box of letters. I went fishing at the little lake. I made food I didn't eat. I sat on the porch and let the sky draw big, slow lines above me. Grief is a long piece of cloth that you have to learn how to wear. The following spring, I went to Kroger to buy milk and apples and cereal. I was in the dairy aisle where it's always a few degrees colder than you expect. I reached for the red cap gallon the same time a woman next to me reached for the 2%. Our fingers brushed the plastic. She said sorry in a voice that reached back through me like a rope thrown across a river. I turned and saw a face mapped by time, but absolutely itself. Dark hair cut short, eyes steady and soft, a mouth that knew how to hold back and then give everything. Lena, I said, and felt foolish and 12 years old and ancient all at once. She studied me the way she did on the side of the road 40 years before. Then she smiled the smallest smile. Charlie, she said. She said my name like you say, a prayer after a too long silence. We stood there in the flood of cold air and the hum of the case and people nudging carts around us. I thought my knees might give out. She laughed at that and put her hand on my elbow until the ground stopped feeling like a boat. Want to get coffee? She asked. There was a little cafe up front that served coffee in paper cups that collapse if you squeeze them wrong. We found a table by the window, and the whole world outside looked like it was holding its breath. We told our versions of the same story. It's a strange thing to hear your life from the other person's porch. She told me about the bus crash, not a pile of twisted metal like in the movies. Just a slick curve, a driver who tapped a brake at the wrong time, a bus that skidded into the guardrail and laid down like it was tired. She woke up under a blue sheet, with a nurse asking her name and someone cutting her jeans off. She thought of me right away and told them you need to call him. She said they checked her purse and found the letter with my address, but the number was smudged. She asked, and then the pain dragged her under. In the days that followed, she would ask for me in the middle of the night, and they would say, "Sweetheart, he hasn't come." They told her there had been a blood drive called because of the crash, and the paper ran a list of donors in a small article titled Heroes of the Storm. She said a friend brought it to her and pointed at my name. She tore out that square of newsprint and kept it on the stand next to her bed. She ran her finger over it when the ache started pulling apart again. She said I had been in the room after all, in a way. That line reached into me like a hand finding another hand in the dark. I told her how I dialed the wrong number again and again, while a perfectly good set of numbers sat inked in her exact hand in a letter trapped behind a baseboard. She shook her head and laughed that small laugh that meant if we didn't laugh, we might drown. She told me she had a husband once, Gary Malone, a good man who liked Sunday drives and cucumbers with salt. They tried and tried to have kids, and then learned there was a fracture inside her from the crash that made that part of life unlikely. They made a home anyway until they couldn't. And then they said, "Thank you. and goodbye like adults who had really tried. She moved back closer to her sister and kept nursing until her back told her it was time to stop lifting other people's weight. I told her about Sharon, and Lena's face wore the kind of grief that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with being human. She asked me what kind of cake Sharon liked on her birthday, and I told her, and we both sat with that a while. We do not share only our loves. We share our losses too. She reached into her purse and pulled out something wrapped in Kleenex. I thought of those little mints my grandmother used to carry. It was not a mint. It was a guitar pick with a smiley face scratched into the plastic. I had given her that pick the night we danced at the VFW, and I told her it was my good luck. She said I tried to mail it back to you once, after the hospital, with a letter asking you to come sit with me on the balcony while the pigeons held their morning conferences. The letter came back stamped address unknown. I stuck the pick in my wallet and carried it for good days and bad days, and decided it could come back to you when I saw your face again. She slid it across the table. I put it in my pocket. It warmed there like a coal. We didn't rush anything. You don't sprint when your knees know better. We met for breakfast sometimes. We walked the park where the old men play chess and argue about the Reds. She told me stories about patients who taught her that bravery is mostly boredom and discomfort arranged into a good attitude. I told her the tricks I used in the trade to stop a rattle that drove a foreman crazy. Once she came with me to the VFW, where I'd given blood that night long ago. The hall smelled like pancakes and lemon cleaner, because they were hosting a charity breakfast, and the floor was shiny enough to see yourself. There was a plaque on the wall listing volunteers from the tornado of '94, and somebody had added a framed clipping from a yellowed newspaper about a rainstorm that brought out donors in 1979. There was my name in tiny type. She stood there tracing it with her eyes, and then she reached up and touched the glass like it was a child's forehead getting checked for fever. "Thank you," she whispered. It took me a second to realize she meant it in more ways than one. We tried to imagine what our life might have been if the letter had found its way, if the bus had stayed on the road, if a thumb hadn't dragged a number into a lie. It's tempting to paint those imagined rooms brighter than any human could stand. I told her the truth. I would likely have still been a stubborn young man who resented anything that told him where to be. She would have worked nights, and we would have learned how to be cranky and tender in the same hour. We might have had babies, or we might have held our breath every month until breath forgot us. We would have fought about money and made up under the hum of a box fan. She smiled at that. She said the thing we know. Now we could not have known. Then is how to forgive the world for not being fair. We clinked our coffee cups like glasses and drank to that. A small twist arrived one afternoon when I went to my mailbox and found a manila envelope with no return address. Inside was a photocopy of a page from a maintenance log at that apartment building I'd lived in. In pencil were notes from the super, some 30 years back, about a radiator leak on the second floor, a mention that the baseboards were loose. There was a stack of mail listed. Landlord says hold it. Going to sort. It was signed by a guy named Vic. I remembered him, a landlord with a habit of selling things that didn't belong to him. Word around then was that he'd taken to keeping stray mail to use as scrap paper, and then stuffed it behind the boards when he thought the inspectors might see. There was also a note from some picker at a yard sale who said he'd found the box of letters in an old storage locker, and when the renovation story made a neighborhood page, he decided to send copies to anyone he could figure out. It struck me then that our lives are not just affected by our choices, but by the sloppy choices of others, and the lazy slants of rain, and the hands that hold hammers in a hurry. You might think a story like this ends with a wedding, and confetti, and a porch swing with a new dog. Life didn't hand us that shape. It handed us something quieter and finer. We made a ritual of Thursday nights, a diner off Route 23 with a waitress who called me honey and Lena dear. She would split a turkey club and eat all the pickles, and I would pretend to be offended. We took Sunday drives to nowhere in particular with the radio low. Sometimes we held hands on the console like teenagers daring anyone to laugh. Sometimes we didn't, and it was still fine. When old songs came on, she would say, "Give it to me," and I would pass her the volume like a baton. She would close her eyes exactly long enough to hear the first chorus, and no longer. We knew how to leave room for ghosts at our table, and not let them do the talking. There was one more twist I want to tell you, because it is the part that keeps me honest with myself. I learned in a sideways way that my best friend from the mill, Cal, had called a number in Louisville once after that storm and left a message on the wrong machine. He had borrowed my address book because he'd spilled beer on his, and he remembered the name Lena and thought he'd do me a favor and say Charlie's on his way. He dialed sloppy and landed in the kitchen of some woman who had just gotten stood up by a plumber. The message he left was an inebriated tangle of words that sounded like a joke to the person who found it. Later, when I finally spoke to a neighbor who used to live across from Lena's old apartment, she said there had been a rumor among some of the nurses that a man had called and sounded cruel, calling her sweetheart in a way that wasn't sweet. Lena and I shook our heads at that and added it to the pile of small misfires that can combine into a house fire. Cal is gone now, and he was more good than foolish, and we decided to let that little anecdote be what it was. A reminder that even people who love you can sometimes make a mess of your life without meaning to. So where are we now, you ask? I live in a house with a chair for Sharon's memory and a chair for mine. Lena lives 20 minutes away in a duplex with a purple clematis crawling up the mailbox post. On Tuesdays, she volunteers at the clinic where someone else changes the sheets and she holds hands. On Saturday mornings, I make pancakes because habit is a kind of grace. We keep each other company without owning each other. Some people say that's sad. I say it's a late masterpiece. We have found a way to love that doesn't need to prove itself to anybody. If there is a balcony in heaven with pigeons holding committee, I hope there's a little table with coffee on it and a notebook and a pen that never runs dry. I hope we all get to sit and look at each other and say, "You hush now, we're fine." If you've stuck with me to this point, thank you. You've been patient with an old man's long memory. Maybe you've got a story with a missing letter in it. Maybe you donated blood once and never knew whose veins it warmed. If you take anything from this, let it be this. The things we do out of kindness on the days we're most tired are the ones that circle back with a lantern when we get lost. Now, if you want more stories like this, please subscribe to Mind-Blowing Stories. It helps so much, and I'm going to be honest, 96 of the folks watching are not subscribed, and it makes me a little sad when I see that number. Hit the like button if this touched you, and tell me in the comments about a love that found you again, or a moment where life surprised you when you thought it was done talking. Thank you for being here. I'll see you next time.